even though we know them being in this relationship is not a healthy choice for them, from a psychodynamic perspective, it's not my job to get them out of this relationship. Of course, as much as I want them to get out, I'm not going to get them out. I want to go in to the space where they are and get in the sand, right, with them, in the fog, in the haze, and understand it from their perspective. Because what I found is until they could feel like someone can really hear them, they're not going to hear anything that I have to say. So presenting reality would be like equivalent to me speaking another language to somebody. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, we're continuing our fascinating discussion with Bre, a certified practitioner and relationship clarity coach. Bre is passionate about helping women heal from confusing and toxic relationships and guiding them toward greater confidence and security. Alongside her clinical work, Bre shares her insights on her podcast and video channel, where she educates and empowers a wider audience with her practical advice. This is part 2 of our discussion. I encourage you to check out part 1, which is available on Bre's channel. I'll include a link to her channel in the show notes below, where you can find that episode and other interesting materials she's created. Welcome, Bre. What did I miss in that introduction?
I think you nailed it.
All
Really,
right.
yeah, the purpose of why I hold space as a coach, the purpose of why I do my podcast and YouTube and all the things is to help women feel less alone and to give them the education around painful relationships, narcissistic relationships, so that they can heal.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I've had an opportunity to listen to some of your content, which we took up in part 1, and we left off on something that you said you were quite excited about. So I just want to orient the listeners before you and I jump back in. So in part 1, Bre and I were talking about trauma bonding, and we started with looking at, like, descriptively, what does it look like? And then we spoke about, where does it come from? In other words, what causes someone to get sort of entrapped in this kind of toxic relationship? So we described it, we looked at the origins, and then we needed to look at a few different theoretical perspectives, like some theories on why they may get stuck in this relationship. And we were throwing around different theories, one of which was from very early in life, they tend to associate love with pain and suffering. And we gave some examples of that, like growing up with an alcoholic, abusive mother. So that was one theory. The second theory was, Bre, jump in and help me if you want, but I mentioned pathological mourning, right? Mm-hmm. So that was that incapacity to really mourn a loss. And that began to explain how it is that they end up back in relationships. Even if they break one off, they may go back to the same person to which they ended the relationship, or they may end up in another abusive relationship. And again, I gave an example of a woman who left her mother, claiming that her mother was dead to her, but then subsequently ended up in a relationship with an abusive man. And then when times were tough financially, ended up back at home with her abusive mother. And the whole cycle just repeated itself. And the third theoretical perspective, and this is where Bre and I left off, was she called it that sometimes these people present as if they're in a fog. And that really resonated with me because in my field, the field of psychoanalysis, we call it like an erotic haze. And I've discussed this in far more detail in earlier episodes on trauma bonding. But that's where Bre and I left off, because having a good theory in mind really informs, how do we work with somebody like this? Like, how can we possibly help somebody who's in a fog, who's sort of impenetrable in a way? They find it really hard to hear anybody else. And that's where we said, we'll kick it to part 2 and we'll pick up specific tools or techniques that we may find valuable in terms of trying to help somebody get their head out of the sand, if I can use Bre's metaphor on this.
We have so many metaphors. The fog, the haze, the sand. Yep.
But I think the listeners get the sense that overall, they're not really available. They're not functioning in the same reality. They're in their own reality when it comes to this stuff. It's like the person I mentioned who's getting scammed, and people who, loved ones in his or her life are saying, this is a scam. Stop giving your life savings to this person. and they just cannot hear that. So let me just start off, Bre, by asking you, do you have any thoughts? And just for the listeners to know, this is basically what Bre and I were doing is like, what do you think about this? Or do you have any thoughts about that? So any thoughts about techniques or tools and techniques for someone who's in this sort of fog?
Yes. Yes. Well, to quickly recap on the last thing we talked with the specific words. So I was talking about potential land. And that's the way that I, in my practice, describe this place that we go to. We dissociate from our reality into this fantasy place where all of the hopes are coming true about the relationship. So we're not fighting anymore. They've gone to therapy. Maybe we've gone to couples therapy. Maybe we're traveling again. Maybe they're writing me all these sweet love letters again. Like whatever the hope is for the relationship to get back to, we're dissociating to that place. Because if I can live in that place, then I get all the yummy dopamine of the anticipation of that coming true. And I don't have to acknowledge the reality that I'm in and feel the grief around never getting what I want that's in potential land. So we stay there out of protection for our ability to feel, to your point, the loss, to feel the grief, to have to actually make the hard decision to leave these types of relationships. And potential land, it's not like a cognitive place where like, okay, I'm going to go to potential land now. It's just a place where our brain is taking us to take us away from the pain of what we're in our reality.
Yeah, no, I could picture it in my mind as I'm listening to you describe it. And if this is a little bit off, just bring me back, okay? But I pictured somebody who has a fantasy that it's like the only if, like if only this would happen. Like, for instance, if they decide to stay in this relationship, it's only if he will, to go back to what we called like, what was it, the love bombing phase, or what I called like the magical union, right? Like if only things can be blissful again. And then finally I will feel like I'm being recognized. And just to loop that in to one of the theories that you and I were throwing around, which was the pathological mourning, you could see how beautifully like this land works for them, because in this land, if they go back to this blissful union with the other, there's no loss, there's no grief, there's no separation. And separation is really painfully difficult, especially for people who are suffering with personality disorders. So all of that can sort of be wiped away just by entering this simple place of the erotic haze or the fog, or, you know?
Yeah. And what I've experienced firsthand in my own healing and in that of my clients is it's not just grief about the relationship ending. That's part of it. But it's grief about who you thought that person was. It's grief about who you were in that relationship, who the dream that you guys were creating that is never going to become real, right? We're grieving so many different layers of things when we let go of a relationship like that. So that makes the stakes even higher to avoid the letting go, to avoid the grief, because there is an onslaught of things that are no longer there that we have to sit with, sit in the discomfort of. And if we don't have experience or the tools to be able to be with our feelings in that way, that's a very scary place to be.
So now you're speaking my language, right? Maybe you're not using the same words, but if I could, again, borrow some psychoanalytic jargon, this is a fantasy. So what you're talking about is helping a patient sort of get some space, let's say, from a fantasy that really takes over their life, right? Is that a safe way for me to say it?
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, we want to think a little bit about tools and techniques today. So how do we help somebody come out of this like fantasy world, which obviously is the most important thing in their life?
Yep. Yeah. We help them come back into reality, which means gathering data around reality. So I'll preface this by saying that the person that I take through these exercises has to have some willingness to look at the reality. If their head is so far down in the sand, that's a different...
Okay, let's dwell on that then just for a second, and then I want to hear about the second part, because that's more often the case in the patients that I work with, because that's part of a personality disorder. In part one, I mentioned that they use, and I meant this not in a pejorative way, but primitive defenses, and one of them is denial. The power of denial is immense. So what if they don't want to come out of that fantasy world? Like, then what?
Yeah, I would actually push that question back to you if because most of the people that I'm working with have some desire to start being curious about these things. So with the clients that you work with, it sounds like who have more of the personality disorders, what do you do? How do you work with that?
So if they're not coming out, you have to go in.
Mm-hmm.
So I go into that space with them. And prior episodes, I refer to this as appreciating the subjectively useful component of a maladaptive defense or experience, right? So even though we know them being in this relationship is not a healthy choice for them, from a psychodynamic perspective, it's not my job to get them out of this relationship. Of course, as much as I want them to get out, I'm not going to get them out. I want to go in to the space where they are and get in the sand, right, with them, in the fog, in the haze, and understand it from their perspective. Because what I found is until they could feel like someone can really hear them, they're not going to hear anything that I have to say. So presenting reality would be like equivalent to me speaking another language to somebody. It would be like a lecture. They would be getting an intellectual lecture, and they're not going to hear something like that. Mm-hmm. So the first way to do it is to get as close as possible. And I know it probably sounds strange because you're like, someone comes for help. How could you not work on getting them out of this space? And this goes back to something that you said in one of your episodes that maybe is a good place to bring this in. Is you said when they make these decisions to be in these relationships, and I'm not quoting you directly, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like they're going against their own values. I don't know if you remember saying that or if you still feel that way.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar?
It does. Yeah. And oftentimes they're not really aware of what their values are, but they feel the friction. They feel that something is not aligned, something is not feeling right. And sometimes they have words for it and sometimes they don't. But yes.
Yeah. So the way when I heard that, I was like really excited again, because it's like phenomenologically, you speak of this like very similar things that I see, but we just use different language. So what we would call that is psychic, that there's some conflict, in other words, psychic conflict. But the problem is for my patients, which sound different than yours, is the conflict is not big enough. You see, they don't want to think about getting out of the space. So after we get close to it, the goal is to try to open up some space or to make the conflict bigger. Like conflict is good, by the way, in life, because conflict, when handled well and it doesn't overwhelm us, pushes us forward. So we would want to make that conflict even bigger, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that leads into the exercise that I take my clients through, where we start gathering data around what's happening now. So a lot of times when we're stuck in potential land and you ask somebody, like, what do you like about this relationship? They're like, oh, we used to do this, this, and this, or we're going to do this, this, and this, right? It's in the past or it's in the future. So the exercise that I take clients through is what is happening now or in the recent past that didn't feel good. So we're identifying an experience, we're identifying how it felt in their body, and then the feelings that they had about it. And sometimes this list starts very small or very short. And then as we're going, they're like, oh, there, I thought of another thing. I thought of another thing. I thought of another thing. And then they're starting to see what's happening in real time in the relationship that is in direct conflict with the future that they think they're in or they think that they can get to. So for instance, if part of my personal experience was part of my potential land was that my ex was going to go to therapy and figure out his addiction so that he could be more available for the relationship. And in reality, he was hiding, he was using behind my back. He was talking very negatively about therapy. He was not participating in couples therapy, right? So I had all of these pieces of data showing me that what I hope to happen is very likely not going to happen because these other things are happening. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. And then I guess eventually, well, what did happen? This is very interesting because reality was there. And I guess initially there was a disavowal or denial. I don't know what was going on, but something was happening that you could not see the reality.
Yep.
What transitioned for you? Like, what did something happen, or was something significant? Like, I'm just curious what allowed you to suddenly come and appreciate reality instead of the fantasy. Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately for me, I had a big dose of reality that happened. So this exercise that I created for my clients came from me actually filling out a restraining order on my ex. And when I had to sit down and line item everything that had happened in the last week of the separation that we were in, it blew my mind on how much of that I was overlooking. And if I was just overlooking that, what was I overlooking in the relationship? So seeing it written on paper is a different experience than what happens in our brain when we like notice something for a moment and then we justify it away, right? Or we notice something for a moment, but then we go to potential land. It's like, it's not resonating. And so for me to see the pages of list items that I had to write for this restraining order, I was like, oh my God, what was I in? So that was my awakening moment. But I've shifted that for my clients to be a little less intense than obviously a restraining order, but helping them start to work with just what's happening in the present, how they're feeling in their body, and becoming more aware of the sensations that arise repeatedly when they're with this person.
Okay, so with your example, it's kind of like I get this immediately, like you writing it down, and somehow you had a capacity to separate out like fantasy from reality. We call this an observing ego. Like you can observe. It's like you got a little space from it, enough space that you could observe it and say, this is not what I want in my life. I get this. But tell me a little bit more, if you don't mind, because now you have me really curious about your approach with your clients. This thing about paying attention to your body, like, because you and I spoke in part one about how being in this sort of dysregulated, hyper-aroused state is such a critical part of this. It's not, we said, it's not pleasant, but it's gratifying because it's reminiscent and it's like a heightened arousal. And if you and your partner can both get into this place, there's a sense of together. And that's like the blissful place, like the blissful union. But how does this play out with your clients, Bre? Like what happens there? Like what do you begin to hear? I guess that's what I'm curious about when you get them into that space.
It opens the conversation for curiosity, because if let's say they're going through their list and they notice that in a lot of these interactions, their chest tightens up and they have a lump in their throat, right? So we're like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that specific sensation is coming up every time you have an interaction with this person, when there's a fight, when there's whatever's happening? And even though that interaction feels familiar, the fighting feels familiar, they can cognitively understand that having a tight chest and a lump in your throat means something different, right? The body is experiencing something similar every time, which means that it's coming from a trigger place, a trigger wounded place. Then we can get curious about what the backstory is there. So it opens that conversation instead of, well, just feels familiar. This is just what I know. It helps them have another piece of data around, oh, and my body's doing this. And I know rationally that if I'm in a healthy relationship, my body shouldn't feel tight and clenched and blocked.
Wait a minute, hold on. You mean not everybody's body feels tense and tight and nobody has a lump in their throat? I'm a little confused.
And sometimes that is the reaction, right? They're like, well, I've lived with this my whole life. What do you mean people don't experience this?
Yes.
So that's another part of the education of, well, you learned relationships a specific way because of your specific past. And this is what a healthy relationship looks like and feels like in your body. But if they've never experienced that, it's foreign to them. So they don't know that this is an abnormal reaction in an attachment dynamic.
Yeah. And just sort of to fill the listeners in again. So one of the things Bre and I were talking about, and please go back and check out that episode if you can, is what happens at this critical point? Like, what if they say, oh, wow, I never knew that people don't walk around with a lump in their throat. But now that Bre is helping me, I no longer have that sensation and I kind of miss it, right?
Yeah.
You see, and again, just for the listeners, what Bre and I were saying is it's very possible that the kind of people that we treat are different. So when you're treating with somebody who has more of these personality characteristics, that is something they'll actually begin to miss.
Mm-hmm.
And they may not even be conscious that they're missing it, but they certainly will then try unintentionally to bring this back in their life by creating some conflict or provoking a fight of some sort, again, outside of their awareness, or they return to the abusive relationship, even though they were free of it and things look very promising. They just couldn't bear it to be without that Nope, it's not about the person, you see? So Bre said that a little bit earlier. They cannot bear to be without that lump in their throat or that tightness in their body. See, that's what's really missing. It's not the person, because objectively speaking, like when you wrote things down, right, Bre, you saw it wasn't about the person. And maybe some of your clients see this too, but then it's like, okay, so then what are you really missing here? Like, what's going on? Mm-hmm. Which is a little bit more characteristic of the work or the things that I bump into in my practice with these people. Yeah.
Which comes back to grief. Mm-hmm. Right? If we're having this epiphany moment of, oh my God, I've only ever lived with a lump in my throat and tightness in my chest, then I have to grieve that that's been my experience. And I have to grieve that I didn't have a healthy dynamic in my childhood. And I have to grieve wherever the root was of learning this is how relationships are. Yeah. And that is hard. That is hard to look at. It's hard to be with. It's hard to feel. It's hard to have the tools to be able to feel that in a healthy way where you don't shock your nervous system into going back into the familiar, right? So having a space holder for that process is vital if you don't have those skills. But it comes back to being able to acknowledge the loss, grieve the loss, so that we're not to your point in the last episode, we're not in the compulsive, repetition compulsion. Yeah. We're not in that cycle. We're not constantly trying to fix the past with the current.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so interesting. We don't have to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it makes me wonder, like, because, I hear this question sometimes is like, what does mourning actually look like? What does separating from somebody actually look like? Yeah. And I don't know, do you have steps for that also in your program? Like if someone is having a hard time, again, I don't know if you encountered this one, but if they're having a hard time, they missed a lump in the throat, and you're talking to them, I don't know if you actually use these words, Bre, but about mourning a loss or grieving, and this is part of the process of letting something go.
Yep.
Does anybody ever say to you, look, this is too painfully difficult? Or maybe they won't even say it. They'll just show you it by returning to, I don't know, some destructive relationship. I don't know if you see that.
Yeah. Yeah, all the time. We want to avoid pain, right? That's a human experience. And so we have to feel safe enough to venture into the pain. And one of the tools that I use in my practice is called EFT tapping. And that stands for emotional freedom techniques. And it's a somatic therapeutic tool that regulates the nervous system. So we are tapping on specific points on our face and our torso and our hands as we're processing about something distressing. So it's regulating the system as I am talking about something distressing, which allows me to be with that feeling. And if I can be with that feeling, then I can start to get curious about that feeling.
What might that feeling be? Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So let's say this example that we were just talking about, the grieving, you had this recognition moment that you've never experienced a healthy relationship, and your feeling in your body has always been that of being on guard around people. So you're having this awareness like, wow, I never learned what that was. I never learned the healthy way to be with that. So in the session, while we're tapping, perhaps there's extreme sadness around all that they've missed out on because they were taught this one specific way of being with people, right? Love equals pain. So being with that sadness allows us to greet that with compassion instead of judgment and pushing it away. So when we judge and push away our emotions, we get temporary relief, right? We distract ourselves with work or Netflix or whatever we're doing, but that emotion is always sort of simmering in the background. So if we can open space and be with it in a safe way, make the nervous system feel safe while we're doing that, then we can get down into the compassionate part and the healing part where we can tend to ourselves. We can tend to what we missed out on. We can tend to the sadness, the void, the grief. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I really appreciate that explanation because when I listen to you, I just do this automatically. I try to make sense out of it using my own words. But the words that I would use is if there are these deeper feelings that are split off, sometimes projected, but they're split off, which means we don't really have access to them.
Yep.
What you do is through helping somebody get into, I'm just using different language, but if I'm butchering what you just said, I know you will bring me back on track.
Yeah.
But you help somebody get into sort of a more reflective, regulated state of mind.
Yep.
And that's always like the first level of business is to help someone get in a place where they can begin to reflect. And once they can reflect, this sadness might come up. And rather than splitting it off or projecting, whatever you do with it,
Yep.
then we begin to integrate it into it becomes part of our personality.
Yep.
And that's one of the key characteristics of working with personality disorders because they're thought to have a fragmented sense of self. So the goal is integration, and we want to integrate mostly feelings that are intolerable. And what you just described very nicely is by slowing them down, getting them into a more regulated state of mind, getting into feelings that they had not had access to before is a way to begin to integrate parts of their personality that were previously split off and projected. Yeah.
Yeah. And IFS work, so internal family systems or parts work, is another therapeutic understanding that I bring into my practice as well, where we talk about parts of ourselves. So I have my inner child part, I have my anxious part, I have my sad part. And that gives us some interoception to be able to observe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If I'm observing this part of me, then that's not the whole me. That's a part of me.
Yep.
And if that's a part of me, then I can tend to that part of me.
Mm-hmm.
And the integration part is really key here because the more that we criticize and push away these parts or these feelings, the farther that we're going to be from our integrated whole self.
Yep. Yep.
So this is how we heal trauma. This is how we work with those frozen traumatic moments in time that froze an emotional response. They froze a belief. They froze a feeling. This is how we start to thaw that and bring it back into our whole experience so that we can say that was a part of my life. I'm no longer running on that default pattern.
Yes. Yep. It's a part of me. It's not all of me. And when it starts to take over as if it's all of me, whatever it is, shame, humiliation, sadness, then we just have to be very careful or try to help them begin to keep in mind, like evoke a memory. Hey, do you remember last week when we were doing this work, you were able to recognize that this is a part of you, right? Mm-hmm. So what happened to that now? Again, I know, Bre, I'm sort of slipping again into more of the like kind of patients that I'm working with because it's more often than not, and that's why it's a long process, is sort of, I guess we could describe it like the deeper that fractured self, the deeper that wound, the more time it takes, because when you start repairing that wound, and they start to experience loss, it's not uncommon that they're going to go right back to where they were before because they think that they don't have the strength to be able to integrate that into their personality. And the only way to do it is to get rid of it, not to integrate it.
The window of tolerance is too small.
Yeah.
So what we want to do with nervous system regulation techniques is widen this window of tolerance so that I can experience more distressing things before I get thrown out into dissociation or into protection mode or into shutdown mode. If I can train my nervous system to know that I'm safe when I'm feeling a little bit of sadness, then I can trust that I'll be safe to feel a little bit more sadness, right? Because we're building that repetition, that experience within our body.
Yeah.
So if we don't have a very wide window of tolerance, then it doesn't take very much to send us into our maladaptive coping mechanism, whatever that is.
I get it. It's all clear now. I just use different language for it. Like in my field, we would call it one's ego, like sense of self, to be able to tolerate, have higher levels of frustration tolerance, impulse control, like all the things that emanate from the ego. So instead of saying like body or energy, I think about it more in terms of like psychological or emotional structures that are in the mind. But in essence, we're saying something very similar. Which is nice when two minds meet like this.
It is cool.
So, so cool. Thank you for that. Is there anything else that maybe you want to mention?
Yeah, I'll give you my website.
Mhm.
On there, there's some free resources for people who can opt in for.
Woo! Free resources are always appreciated.
Yeah, getting stuff for free. I have a free relationship reset guide, and I have a free love bombing guide to kind of take yourself through to be able to recognize love bombing a little bit easier. So you can find those on my website as well.
Great. Well, listen, a big thank you again for coming on the show and for taking a better part of your day to sort of flush out some of these really, really complicated concepts around trauma bonding, grief, pathological mourning, confusing love and hate. I mean, these were just some of the theoretical concepts we were throwing around. And now to try to see how we work with it specifically with the patients that you work with. So thank you again, Bre.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, everybody. Until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.